Okay, this is 4:01. So I suggest we start, and I'd like to tell you a warm welcome to this seminar across the Atlantic 2021, whose title is Shaping the Future of University Lifelong Learning, Old Ways and New Roads. This seminar is offered by UCAN, the European University Continuing Education Network, AAACE, the American Association for Adult and Continuing Education, and UPCEA, the University Professional and Continuing Education Association. I'm Pascal Pachoud from the Formation Continue UNIL-PFL, the Continuing Education Foundation of the University of Lausanne, and EPFL in Switzerland. I'm also a member of the UCAN steering committee. So within the last few months, and we can almost say last few years, we have all witnessed all the current pandemic has accelerated some of the trends in lifelong learning and have kind of triggered new ones. We've seen how digitalization accelerated. We started talking about hybrid learning, about high flex, bimodal, hybrid working, work from home, Zoom, all those words we are now very familiar with. Considering this, we will try today to answer some of the following questions. What will the future of university lifelong learning look like? How will continuing education courses be delivered? Online, face-to-face, blended, bimodal, iFlex? Will we all work from home? How can we prepare for what comes next? So today we have the privilege to welcome two presenters, Professor Attila PAUSITS from the Danube University Krems in Austria, who will speak about the future of non-formal and informal learning and the implications for higher education. And Professor Tricia Berry, who is Associate Dean and Director at Purdue Global University, who will speak about the trends for lifelong learning in the modern world. So I will just introduce the two speakers with a few more words before they start speaking. Attila PAUSITS is head of the Department for Higher Education Research and Professor for Higher Education Research at the Danube University Krems, Austria. He's the academic director of the Erasmus Mundus Joint Master Program, Research and Innovation in Higher Education. He's also a chairman of the European Higher Education Society and spokesman of the Austrian Higher Education Research Network. I could continue like this for minutes, but Attila, pardon me, but I will I will stop here. But you have a very impressive background and bio. Dr. Trish Berry serves on the board of directors for the American Association of Adult and Continuing Education as a director for the Commission of Distance Learning and Teaching. Trish is the Associate Dean and Director of Clinical and Practicum Programs for Purdue University Global. She holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Education with a specialization in organizational leadership for North Central University. And I will stop here. I could also continue for minutes or hours with your impressive background. So I think we have a fantastic group today, and we will start with a presentation from Attila, who will speak, for about 20-25 minutes. Then we will give an opportunity to Trish to react to this presentation from an American perspective. And then we will swap. Tricia will give her presentation. Attila will have an opportunity to react to this, and then we will really open the floor and answer the questions on the chat. So I hope we all have a great time. Attila, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Pascal, for your kind introduction. Thank you, eucen, for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity and a pleasure to introduce or talk about a study which we just conducted recently for the European Commission. But before I start, let me give you one promise. And the promise is that I'm not going to use the word COVID, at least in the next 25 minutes during my presentation. So I hope that the sharing my screen is going to work. Let's see, can you see my screen, the first slide? Very good. So as Pascal already mentioned, the title of this presentation is in fact an invitation for you attending this event to take a journey with me and look into the future. I would like to share with you some ideas how we came up with the different future perspectives, which I'm going to show you in a minute. Basically, the purpose of this initiative, and if you look and listen to the official communication coming from Brussels, but also from different national governments in the last couple of years, is pretty much related to non-formal and informal learning and the importance of the validation of this experiences, expertise, knowledge, and competences, and the bridges between the formal and non-formal education or knowledge sphere, especially coming from the university. I think, and this is most probably not only the case in Austria, but also elsewhere, that the ministry put a lot of effort to look at the validation processes of universities and how to incorporate, so to say, non-formal and informal learning into a more formal processes. So how to overcome these silos of a traditional educational system of the past. So the purpose of this study for the Commission was, in fact, to look at in the future with the time perspective of 2030 to see what the future of the development of non-formal and informal sector, given or driven by certain drivers and developments which we can and could observe towards the different spheres, including policy, but also business and other sectors around us. So what I would like to do is kind of divide my presentation into four sections. I would like to talk about the trends and drivers really briefly. I would like to pay a bit more attention to scenarios. Then I would like to ask you to validate or assess, so to say, these three different scenarios, and maybe that could be a starting point also later on for our discussion. Let's see how my time management is working out. I would like to give you some generic conclusions over the three scenarios, and then especially certain implications for university lifelong learning based on those three scenarios which we conducted in this particular study. Behind the study is a Foresight Method which we use to develop our scenarios. Maybe you are familiar with the Foresight Method. First, we look at the different drivers and trends. We try to identify them. Then we used a panel of experts, around 200 experts responded or assessed our drivers, which we kind of conducted through literature review, but also while looking at different sources like internet and others. Then we had an interactive workshop back in Brussels before the word which is I'm not going to use happened to us. And then we developed and finished those three scenarios. So basically, the trends, and I think this is not something new, all of us, which are related to digitalization, society, economy, the educational sector, we look at the different perspectives of learners, demands, institutions, educators, but also the policymakers. Based on this, we developed a large set of different trends and drivers, and we are, as I mentioned before, assessed by international experts based on their impact and the uncertainty. What you see is a kind of a map of our drivers, and you see the different colors which represent the different themes or dimensions regarding the drivers. And the most interesting, if you develop a scenario, the most interesting part is always the top right section. Why is it so? Because in order to develop different scenarios, you need trends which have a high impact and at the very same time also high uncertainty. So this is the way usually how you come up with the different scenarios. And you can see here those scenarios or trends which we selected, so to say, in order to develop the different scenarios. One is related to digitalization. Another is related to skills. So I think it's also obvious. The different educational pathways, to new types of institutions which may arrive and increase in the future in our European or global higher educational landscape. The different learning skills, as well as the diversity of learners, higher educational institutions, and then, of course, the policy support. And this was maybe one of the driving forces why the European Commission asked us to develop this study, also to reflect and identify their roles and responsibilities, and maybe also some ideas for further policy development within the European higher education area or educational area. So you can see here another tool, which is the morphological box. I'm not going to talk about this. I think the most important here is that we came up with 3 different scenarios. The first we call hybrid learning. And just to clarify, hybrid learning has a different meaning here, as we would most probably use today the notion of hybrid learning, which most of the cases would lead to a discussion about a teaching and learning scenario where you have in-class educational activities, and then at the very same time you have followers, students, listeners via internet, for example. In our hybrid scenario is something else. I will come back to this in a second. Digital transformation and market-driven education. So these are the 3 labels which I'm going to explain a bit in a more detailed way now. So the hybrid learning scenario is a balanced mixture of tradition and future trends. It also describes the relationship with an increasing role of the economy and co-producer and collaborator towards qualitative and quantitative transformations of learning. New institutions will emerge and specialize to promote and recognize non-formal and informal learning, especially based on digital learning. These new institutions will emerge from both the public and the private sector. Through these newly emerged institutions, learners will be able to critically assess their skills and learning gaps to find the right program for upskilling, reskilling, or for their personal goals. There is a growing education sector, including non-formal education providers and informal learning content developers, but also including the traditional education sector with all its players and institutions. To help align individual learning needs, career perspectives, and available learning content, lifelong learning avatars will support individuals. These avatars act as individual lifelong learning service providers. They identify skill gaps and learning needs, search for learning content and possible learning solutions, including programs and available content, but also support the recognition of prior learning. The education sphere and the economy will work together more closely, which will lead to higher employment rates and a better balance between the demand and supply of educated and skilled workforces. In return, the economy will respond more to human well-being, diversity, and work education life balance by supporting flexible working conditions and employment scenarios. Vertical and horizontal mobility of the workforce between different economic sectors will increase due to digitalization and a better acquisition of transversal skills on the job market. In return, the educational sector will continuously open more towards the economy and accept and recognize the validation expertise and power of the economy, but also other societal organizations and NGOs as well. The formal education sector will open towards non-formal learning activities, skills and competences developments outside their comfort zone, and will be more open to adopt their services, teaching and learning processes, where recognition and validation become a more fundamental and core part of teaching and learning. The borderlines between informal and non-formal learning on the one hand and formal education on the other hand will be saturated by new inclusive networks and initiatives to foster, for example, innovation pedagogy inside and outside the educational sector. With the use and access to the internet and other sources, the role and importance of informal learning will increase within lifelong learning frameworks starting at elementary education. Digitalization as an important driver will enable and empower learners and markets and makes it easier to access the content in order to fulfill learning needs, not only in professional life, but also in private life for almost all parts of the society. So this is basically some kind of description of a first scenario, the hybrid learning. The second scenario, the market-driven education, and as the name most probably will lead to a kind of a picture, this scenario is characterized by rapid changes in skills and competences and unequal access to non-formal education, despite increasing new forms of learning, for example, online learning. The role of non-formal learning is increasing, and this is particularly addressed by the private sectors. Those private actors, intermediaries, corporate social organizations are further growing and serving changing market needs, also due to the digitalization of society and the economy. Private institutions will be quick to respond to the changing requirements from the economy and market-driven in-demand skills. In contrast, public education institutions and public policy only slowly adapt to the transformation and requirements of the society and the economy. The fragmentation within Europe further enables this development. The main driver is the demands of the economy. It is expected that less emphasis will be put on transversal skills compared to occupational skills. Many actors operate with a short-term outlook and may overlook the long-term needs for the economy. For example, the need for creativity and innovation thinking or innovative thinking as a basic skill. Increasing emphasis on employability and skills for employability will undermine the value of civic and democratic values. Different types of literacies, for example, media and information literacy and leisure activities. Moreover, the cost of trainings will also create the problem that market-driven skills for the economy will bring more profit compared to programs for basic skills. Private actors will be faster and more flexible in adopting the newest technologies in learning. Digitalization of learning will not be limited to course content, but also assessment, validation, and certification will be heavily digitalized. Privatization and digitalization of non-formal learning will support creating more flexible and adaptive learning paths, which can be seen as an opportunity as alternative learning routes can be recognized more easily. The biggest challenge in this scenario is the increasing social inequality and social inclusion. Privatization is shifting the burden of learning onto the individual, and this generates a considerable division among social groups. And then the very last scenario, which is labeled digital transformation. And this scenario covers two different aspects. The digital transformation of learning, which extends learning processes to the virtual space via online courses, but also digital transformation of our environments, especially Industry 4.0, with its newest requirements for innovation and learning. This means that digital competences are embedded into school curricula, encouraging children from early on to handle the technology and work with it. Strong control of the digital industry on the learning content tends to play down topics such as social sciences, the arts, humanities, or philosophy. Big data and powerful algorithm are the key drivers of this scenario. However, there is one economic concentration power. There's only few companies on the technology and life cycles are dictated by purchasing licenses for a determined time period. The implications of fast-moving technological progress into third structures calls for adaptive learning, non-formal and informal learning, education modules, neither public or private, can fully anticipate the necessity of these processes. Understandably, access to digital tools and the web is essential for participation and learning in this environment. However, there is also, precisely in digital inclusion, tensions arise because too many segments of the population are excluded. Many people, learners, are overwhelmed by the number of teaching offerings and learning offerings of an informal and non-formal nature. They have difficulties finding their pathways in the jungle of courses and online information. As technology evolves quickly, teachers have to keep up and engage in continuous vocational training and qualifications, especially with technology and new pedagogical methodologies. Software tools, social networks can support individualized learning based on individual biography and demand. NGOs have a new role of mentorship in this context. They provide new frontiers in learning, harnessing particularly non-formal and informal learning. So these are kind of a brief presentation of those three different scenarios with some key lines which might help you to understand the differences between the three scenarios. Just to repeat it, hybrid learning, a kind of a continuation, I would say the continuation of a road which we already started to go up. The second is maybe a shift to a market-driven education, which would lead to a shift from more private instead of public responsibility when it comes to lifelong learning. And the third one is a very strong focus on digital transformation in all directions regarding society, but also regarding teaching and learning. And based on this, I would like to ask you to use now the Zoom pool and maybe give your views on the three different scenarios. There are two questions. So the first question is likelihood, and the second question is related to desirability. It looks like that we have a kind of a tension towards the hybrid learning, digitalization, and somehow we do not really like the market-driven education. So if I conclude in a very short way, this the first part. So the first was about likelihood and how desirable is the particular scenario is in your views. Okay, so it looks like it's pretty much the similar picture regarding the evaluation, hybrid learning first, and then more or less ex equal market-driven education and the digital transformation. All right, thank you very much. If you look now to the results, can you see again the slides, the assessment of the scenario? So this is the result what we received from our experts regarding the different scenarios. And I would say that it's pretty much the same what we received here today regarding the likelihood talking about the hybrid learning and the market-driven education. Well, in terms of the desirability, I had a feeling that it was a more divided view today here. Still hybrid learning in the first place, but the market-driven and digital transformation are kind of ex-aequo. Coming to, most probably eucen is going to provide a presentation later on, so I do not really have a time at this very moment to give you scenario-specific conclusions, maybe just some generic conclusions regarding all three scenarios. What we see that there is a need or is a challenge regarding the alignment of formal, non-formal, and informal learning systems. So I think this is something which definitely need to be well discussed and developed based on our traditions and also maybe this inside-looking perspective of the different sectors in the field of education. Therefore, I think we need a cross-sectoral collaboration, not only within the different educational levels and systems and sectors, but also between business, for example, the world of work and the world of education. Digitalization, I think this is something that turned out in all three scenarios going to be a key element. The trainer, the development of competences and skills in order to deal with the different scenarios. I think this is obvious. And then how to facilitate these institutional changes, which will definitely, well, foster us, given to these scenarios, to develop our organizations itself. Talking about development of the organization, so what are the implications for higher education? The first, I think, foremost, the most important is how to link the formal and non-formal and informal system. Who has the responsibility to develop or guide through this? Is it the ministry? Is it the individual learner who is going through, for example, validation processes? Are these the companies? They identified maybe certain competences and they would like to acknowledge this. So who is going to lead the development or the linkages or the development of this new system, which should be a more well, connected system between the different forms of learning in the future? And I think here, especially those centers at those universities dealing with continuing education, so the university continuing education could play a mediator role based basically on our experiences in the past. And I think this is something what we also know these days when it comes to the validation at higher education institutions, that those centers, they have the experience because they did it already in the past. So how to develop those processes, how to promote the cross-sectoral cooperation, especially the adult education and continuing education parts. At least in our tradition in Austria, these are two different pillars, very key pillars, but there is very little interaction between the two. So how to promote this cross-sectoral cooperation, vertical and horizontal way. Talking about the evaluation tools, development of methods, very, I think, crucial, this micro-credentials, which is nowadays, I think, one of the hot topics at different levels at macro, meso, and micro level. How to deal with digitalization. Is it enough if you establish a CIO, CDO at the university? What kind of strategies, what kind of structures are needed in order to facilitate and support the process of digitalization as an enabler? And then, last but not least, how to implement those institutional changes which are needed in order to adopt and follow those scenarios in the future. And I think this should be also a transformation in terms of knowledge and competencies vis-a-vis lifelong learning. So those knowledge about lifelong learning needs to be also developed by other parts of the universities, other university professionals, and not only those who are engaged and involved in university continuing education. And last but not least, maybe one of the crucial elements, which are the financial models which are in favor or support those developments, which I briefly described today here. Last but not least, as I mentioned, this is the study conducted by the Danube University together with our colleagues from the Austrian Institute of Technology, published last year. You can find the entire publication on the website of the European Commission, but I'm also happy to discuss those scenarios and implications with you today, and later on also maybe via email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attila. Very interesting presentation. We'll keep the questions for the end when we will answer all the questions. But I would like to ask Trish maybe to comment on this presentation by Attila. Trish, who will give a comment from a view from the US after a presentation from a European.
Yeah, thank you, Pascal, and thank you, Attila. It's always interesting to hear the perspective from another country. The other thing that I just kept thinking as you were presenting is that the issues are very parallel. The challenges that we face in the United States, we might call them something different and label them different things, but they're really very parallel to the kinds of things that you presented in your report as well. I think we all face the challenge of number one, how do we scale up, and how do we get our institutions to be able to teach in this modern world and to work with our learners in this modern world, because it's very different than back when we had classrooms and chalkboards. It's changed dramatically. And then how do we get our population, not only our learners, but our employers, our career markets, all of those folks adapted to these expectations as well? Because if we're changing internally in an institution, that's awesome. But if no one else is on board, those changes are probably not going to go over very well. So I'm curious, Attila, what do you see the biggest resistance for change being in Europe? What are some of the biggest barriers for making some of these transitions that you've talked about?
Well, thank you for this question. Two quick answers. First is success. As long as you are successful in the given scenario, in your given reality, you are not thinking about the future. You just enjoy the given setting and then the situation. Success is a danger, first. And the second, if I compare kind of this educational mindset or also the approaches, if I look to the US and Europe, I would say, even though we use the same buzzwords, even though we most probably have the same issues, my feeling is that education in Europe is pretty much problem-driven, and education in the US is opportunity-driven. And maybe this is a kind of a tradition which needs to be, re-engineered, developed further, changed. We need maybe a game changer in order to take the risk, which is, I think, in these rapid changes are needed. So you can't really always act in a more progressive and kind of slow way. I think this is maybe the second, which I would see as a major issue: success and this problem-driven mindset instead of opportunity.
That's an interesting perspective, and I hadn't picked up on that. So I appreciate that perspective. I think the other thing that I wondered as I was listening to your conversation, we have a lot of conversations in the US, especially after that word that you don't want to use today happened. But in terms of access and equality, and that's been a huge topic of conversation across all levels of education in the United States, not even just higher education. What's your sense of that on the European perspective in terms of having equal access, and what kinds of things are being done to help equalize where there are deficits?
I mean, if you look to the Bologna process and the recent communique coming from Rome, equality and the social dimension, especially related to higher education, is one of the key dimensions these days and for the upcoming years. So I think this issue and this topic has arrived. I think national higher education educational systems are questioned, and they need to develop certain strategies and solutions here. I think this is clear, but on the other hand, we still know what are the bottlenecks and what are the challenges, for example, when it comes to access to higher education regarding underrepresented groups, social background, and so on. So I think this is not something that we will solve from one day to another. And maybe a kind of critical perspective on that, and maybe this is against what I just said before regarding those scenarios and future opportunities, that the innovation, talking about innovation and tradition, I think one of the key elements for us for a higher education or educational sector is integrity. So how to keep the integrity of the institution, relying on the tradition, relying on people and processes, and as we know, besides the church and the military, especially higher education institutions are the oldest organizations. So how to keep this tradition or habitus in the very same time moving into innovation. And I would say, in terms of organizational perspective, there's a very thin line between integrity and innovation. So the danger of losing the integrity of an organization by fostering the change too fast and too deeply, I think this is something that need to be discovered in the future. But just coming back to this equality issue, I think we have, again, this, as just you started, I think we have the same topics, maybe the different speed and different spots in these discussions, and we use the same recipients in order to prepare the dish and solve the problem. In both cases, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. And Pascal, do we have time for one more question, or should we go ahead and move on?
One more.
One more. I love your perspective on balancing tradition with innovation, Attila. And I think from my perspective, that's where we struggle a little bit in higher ed, because people want to hang on to tradition so tightly that they won't embrace innovation. Do you have insight into how institutions and faculty members could balance those needs?
Staff development. I have the feeling that this very moment of times of digitalization, and I think after 25 minutes now I'm able to use the word COVID. That COVID is a trigger. I think we really had a fast development in terms of digitalization, developing digital processes. The danger here is it is a kind of too strong focus on instruments and tools, and we are kind of losing the human perspective. I think this is what still higher education institutions make higher education institutions. These are the people, and I think instruments, yes. But organizational development is always linked to staff development. And I think this is that would be my answer to this, which is, I would say, most probably the biggest challenge and opportunity in the very same time for us.
So what I take from that is one of the ways we can advance education is by educating our people to the tools and things that we can use. We have to educate ourselves to be able to educate others. With that, does that align with what you're thinking, Attila?
In a nutshell, yes. Most probably we could, continue this discussion for hours. But yeah, well, it would be maybe one dimension to overcome this in a certain period of time. I think time is very critical. So we do not really have a time. There is a very speedy development here. And we all know that especially staff development and the development of human capital takes time. And I think this is something that we need to balance the speed of these different dimensions, technology and people.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think and I'll talk about this here in just a moment in my presentation, but at least in American higher ed, most changes have come in times of great change within society. And we're seeing that with this pandemic, that there are great changes in society, and we're probably going to have to adjust in higher ed. But I love your idea of being able to hang on to tradition, but also embrace innovation and creating the balance between those. I think that will be our challenge for sure.
Thank you very much for this dialogue across the Atlantic. I suggest we move to your presentation, Tricia, and then we'll have time to come back on some of the questions you discussed.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to follow up to Attila's presentation, and I will tell you, we did talk ahead of time about what we were going to be presenting, but we didn't talk details, and so it's interesting to me to see how things are going to align, because they align very nicely.
Trish, do you want to click on the full screen icon so we see? It's a little one at the bottom of the presentation. To the right.
The display setting?
No, it's you go 3 more to the right.
Right here?
Next one, this one, yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, can you see it now? Is that better?
Excellent, thanks.
All right, awesome. So I wanted to just start by giving you context, because I think it's important to understand the perspective your presenter is coming from. So I do come here representing the American Association of Adult and Continuing Education. In that organization, I serve as the leader for our distance learning and teaching group. And so our group is all focused on developing skills and competencies and sharing knowledge related to distance learning and teaching. Professionally, my role is with Purdue University Global, and I think it's important to share information about this because it will give you a lot of insight into my context. We are a 100% online university, so we do not ever see our students face to face. We do all of our education delivery online. I've actually been with the online component of our organization for about 15 years. And so we have extensive experience working in digitalized environment and through online delivery of education. For us, when the pandemic hit, there weren't big changes because we were already delivering our services online, but we have seen a lot of things that have changed in the world overall that have impacted us, which is what I'll talk about here. But I felt it was important for you to understand that context. I come from a background of teaching primarily online for the last 15 years. I haven't been in a classroom in 15 years. So it's a very different perspective, maybe than where a lot of you are coming from. What I'm going to do today is just talk really quickly about the history of higher ed in the US, because I think that helps us understand how we got to where we are now. And then we'll talk about what the pandemic did to higher ed. Unlike Attila, I'm going to use the pandemic word and the C word occasionally during my presentation, as the catalyst for change in our systems. And then we'll talk about kind of where things go from here, or what we're seeing in the US for trends. So within the United States, and this is an incredibly abbreviated generalized version, so there's a lot of stuff left out because we have just a very short amount of time today. But early in the United States, higher education was based in religion. And all of you know, the United States got our start from European settlers. So clearly much of what we do is rooted in European traditions as well. And really the goals early on in higher ed in US were about character development, moral development, and then also about creating educated people who could vote and help to participate in the democracy that was being built in this country. The pedagogy for early higher ed was much about reciting and memorization. It was a lot about taking in facts and giving facts back. And the role of a faculty member at that point was really supervision and control of the students. So a couple of key points in evolution of higher education in the US, and again, this leaves out a whole bunch of detail, but here's a couple of key things. One of the first major changes was with land-grant institutions in the 1860s. These were actually established by Abraham Lincoln, and they were set up in order to facilitate better access to education. Early in the 1800s, there were only like 23 institutions of higher education in the United States. After the creation of land grants, that number increased to over 800 institutions of higher education. So Lincoln, at the end of the Civil War and during the Civil War process, saw a need for this. The other key thing that happened with that is it marked the beginning of the government being involved in higher education. And so that obviously shifts how things are managed once the government is involved and it's not institutions outside of the government. Another key piece of growth then was post-World War II. In order for the government to get the economy going, there was a lot of stimulus for the gentlemen returning from war for education. And so that created another key turning point in American higher ed. And then also in the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement provided another key turning point and expanding access for higher ed. Traditionally in the US, the structure and the pedagogy has really been focused more on the institution rather than the learner. And again, this is a generalization and it's not a judgment, but the institutions were structured in order to be able to run efficiently and deliver learning to students in an efficient manner. Typically also in the United States, those institutions are focused on the 18 to 25-year-old learner. Here it would be people who have just graduated from high school and are sort of transitioning into adulthood. And most traditional courses were used with a lecture format where a faculty member is, they have specialized knowledge and they're going to convey that knowledge to the students. And it's kind of a one size fits all for the students. Everybody in that classroom's getting that same experience. And we hinge on the amount of time a student is in a class, sitting in a class, on testing and then grades as assessment of learning. So at the same time, we have all of these traditional institutions happening. We also have distance education being developed. And distance education actually started in the late 1800s. There were some correspondence courses that were put together for people who couldn't physically gather together. And that was the first time there was an acknowledgement of, gosh, you know, people need to learn, but they can't actually be in a specific location to do that learning. How can we make this happen for them? Obviously, over time, technology has increased our ability to provide that kind of education. We don't have to write letters and mail things back and forth anymore. We have lots and lots of different ways to do that. And in the early 1990s, the first fully online universities began. And a great statistic here, by 2015, 2016, about 43% of students in the US had higher ed courses online. So lots and lots of online delivery here in the US. Now, the other parallel piece to this is the market forces. And Attila talked about this from the European perspective. But what's happened in all governments, I think, as there's always more of a demand for funding, more services, more funding, and there's always less money for everyone to share. And so as government funding has decreased, our institutions of higher ed have had to look at where they can get other funding sources. So much of that is coming from partnerships and grants, which is from within the market. That also means, though, that if you're bringing that funding in from the market, the employers are going to be more engaged and they're going to have more demands for higher education. And what we see right now in the US is that there's a lot of preference for skills and specific skills, sometimes more so even than degrees, that employers are wanting students to have these, or their employees to have these skills. Maybe the degree doesn't matter so much as just what skill they're able to apply. The focus in higher ed right now is really not on moral development and on character development as it was back in the early days. It's much more toward critical thinking. It's much more about social and economic mobility, workforce development, and then also outcomes of the learner. And that kind of speaks to what Attila was saying earlier. It's about opportunity when we bring our students into higher ed. Okay, so that's all traditional higher ed. How does that apply to the adult learners? Well, right now, or at least pre-pandemic, it gave lots and lots of options for our adult learners. Lots of different ways they could get their knowledge and their skills. Obviously, traditional face-to-face classrooms at a college campus were one option, and all the way from that to fully online options where students never had to go to face-to-face classes and could do everything online. And then in the middle, some blended options where they maybe are doing some things online, some things either weekends or evening classes. So there's a balance there. The other options that you see a lot in the US for adults coming into light is professional certifications and micro-credentials. So smaller pieces of education, continuing education that are provided, not necessarily by institutions of higher education, but through professional associations and organizations. The sources for learning, again, are listed there: higher ed, professional associations, continuing ed, and employers as well have transitioned into providing training for their employees. Okay, so that's the history, and that sets the stage for what happened about a year ago. And that pandemic, that nasty COVID word, Attila mentioned we had a lot of forced change. And we all know that the greatest changes in society happen from forced change. Most of us aren't ones that want to go out and seek change, and we don't want radical reformation. That comes from something happening that forces us to make changes. So as you all know, higher ed moved online, but also so did businesses. So the changes weren't forced just in the higher ed world. It was forced across all sectors of any business or anything people were doing. And we did that with limited planning and preparation, and with limited infrastructure to support the transition, and with limited preparation for the students and employees. So people were kind of pushed into these situations where they had to figure things out on their own, or organizations had to help their employees figure things out. And then we all know there were multiple social, political, and economic influences pushing on all of that as well. So what's happened with all of that in the last year? I think it will be interesting 10 years from now to look back and say, gosh, here's what really happened. Here's what we saw. But right now, what we know is that organizations have adapted. It's been a joy to me to see that organizations have realized that virtual work can be really effective. As I said, I've been doing this for a really long time. I love working virtually, but there were a lot of places that were resistive to that and felt as though employees couldn't be effective and organizations couldn't run well. And that's not true. There are a lot of situations where things can be effective, and we can get a better understanding of what needs to be face-to-face and maybe what things can be done with a little less face-to-face interaction. We do know that our social inequalities are more apparent, and so there are a lot of things we're going to need to be addressing. And then we also know there's some discord here in the United States between what student expectations are and what learning experiences are. There have been some lawsuits filed for students who don't feel that their online coursework is meeting what their expectation is for learning. And so there's definitely some differences of perspective and how this is going to play out and what effective teaching and learning is going to look like. So that all sets the stage for where we are today and where we potentially will be going in the future. From my perspective, I think the potential for adult learning and for lifelong learning is fantastic because there's such a better acceptance of online learning now, within limits, because people were forced to do things so quickly and without the training that Attila mentioned is so important, and without the support, that I do think we're going to have to go back and fill in some gaps and help people understand a little bit more, help build some stronger infrastructure for things. But we know what our adult learners need is they need flexible, active learning experiences. They need to be able to meaningfully apply what they're doing. They need to do it in a multimodal situation. They want their experience acknowledged. They don't want a situation where they're having to start over just because someone in a classroom tells them that they haven't formally learned something in this classroom yet. They want to be able to keep up with market changes, and then they also want that to be affordable. We know our employers, our market forces, they need a flexible labor force. Again, they need it to be able to keep up with market changes. They need employees who can maintain whatever it is they're doing in their roles, but they also have to be developing new skills, and that they have strong soft skills. And then employers also need trainings that are targeted and scalable so that they can be effective in how they deliver those. So some ways that we can work to adjust this. The first thing is transfer credit policies. In the United States, students can transfer, and I'm sure in Europe as well, they can transfer credits from one university to another. So students come in, they have some credits, they drop out of school, they go back somewhere else, they can take those credits somewhere else. In a lot of ways, our systems are set up to not allow them to transfer those credits very easily. And there are a lot of policies and procedures in place that create barriers for those transfer credits. We know that our adult learners are more transient and that they're less likely to finish a degree with one enrollment than people were 30, 40, 50 years ago. And institutions really need to work to minimize those barriers in transfer credits and allow credits to come from institution to institution. That's effective for students because they don't have to sort of start over with coursework. It also is effective in terms of time and money for students. There also need to be intentional policies and processes that support the needs of those students. There's a lot of research out there that shows that a student who's transferring into an institution has a very different set of needs than a brand new undergraduate student or a brand new student coming in for the first time. So one way institutions can help support lifelong learning is by taking out those barriers, taking down the walls, and then giving the students the support they need to progress through their lifelong learning experience. Prior learning assessment is something that Attila mentioned a couple of times during his presentation, and this is something we're seeing in the United States too as being very important. In higher ed, we like to think that we have the corner on learning, like we're the ones that know if people have learned or not. But the reality is people are learning every day, and they're not always learning in classrooms. They're learning through professional experiences and social experiences. And if you have someone who has job experience, but maybe not formal education, why can't we let them show what they know and show what they know how to do and get credit for the skills they already have? Our traditional approach in education has been, nope, you have to start over in our classroom and you have to show us that you know these things. But for the future and for helping our lifelong learners, allowing them to come into a situation where they can assess, that they can either test out of knowledge they already have, or we use a lot of portfolio tools as well, where students can build portfolios, show their work experience, and show a lot of the things that they've accomplished in the past so that they don't have to start over and spend time and money in a classroom showing that they know these things. Work experience credit, and then also a big thing in the US is military training credit. The military has a very different way of training people, but those folks that leave the military come out with strong skills, and they often get discounted in the civilian world. So being able to transition those folks into getting credit for their military training so that they can move forward with lifelong learning instead of us driving them backwards and making them reset where we think they should be. Another great tool, I think, for lifelong learning is an academic progression. And again, traditionally in higher education, we've developed degrees in kind of vacuums. And this one bachelor's degree maybe doesn't feed into a master's degree, or a certificate doesn't feed up to a bachelor's. One of the things we've been working really hard on at Purdue Global is creating what we call stackable degrees. And this is a trend we're seeing in the US, where a student starts at an entry-level degree or certificate, and it stacks right into or transitions right into the next level of degree. And I, with permission of my institution, I'm sharing just one pathway we have here. We have a medical billing and coding certificate for our students. That's a 6-month program. They can gain some skills so they can go into employment. But then all of the courses for that block transfer into a bachelor's degree. So the students can step right up into a bachelor's degree program and pursue their bachelor's degree without having to go back or start over or losing any credit. And then those credits from either of those bachelor's programs that they choose have the chance to be block transferred into a master's degree program. And again, it makes a smooth transition for them. So what we're doing with this is promoting lifelong learning and making it more effective for our adult learners to move forward, rather than having to restart and reset if they decide they want to go to a higher level degree. And then I think the last thing is collaboration. And again, Attila touched on this. It was interesting to me in the polls that people weren't as excited about market drivers for education. Because I sort of feel the opposite. I feel like if we can figure out how to collaborate with higher ed and with our market forces to create things that are meaningful for people, that's the best learning experience for our lifelong learners. Yes, we want them to have the foundations in education and critical thinking and all of those things that are the tradition of our institutions that are so important, as Attila talked about. But we also need people to be able to participate in our markets and in our economies. And so working with the employers to understand what that is and how we can synthesize that, I think, is an important piece of collaboration that from my perspective, higher ed is still a little reluctant to address. And then I think also within the US, the professional associations related to specific disciplines, you see this a lot in healthcare and also in IT a lot right now, where there are specific kind of narrow certifications and micro-credentials developed. But those associations bring in expertise about their industry as well, that if you could do some crossover with higher ed and those associations and employers, I think we'd create a fabulous environment for our lifelong learners and be able to create some pathways for them that would be really effective. There's a quick slide with references, and I know this is going to get passed out, so I'll just fast forward through that one. And then here, last slide, my contact information. If anybody wants to reach out, I love to have these conversations. It's fun to talk about this, and I love hearing the perspectives from people outside of the United States as well. So feel free to reach out if you have any interest in doing so. I'd love to hear from folks. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Trish, for your presentation. And now we're going to have a European reaction to this presentation from the US. Attila, if you want to comment.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Trish, for leading us through the entire history of higher education in the US and within minutes. I think you did really did a great job in pointing out the most important cornerstones and milestones in the history, and then going to your institution, which is, I think, a very specific type of higher education institution. And then just wondering regarding the impact and the facts on a distance learning, for example, towards virtual international mobility. So what kind of effects did you see, for example, in terms of admission, in terms of your student population, maybe driven or caused by the pandemic?
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's a loaded political question too, right? Because we had a lot of immigration things happening in the United States too that were sort of related to that. And because I don't work in a more traditional institution, I'm not totally equipped. I can tell you what I've seen in general trends. I know that international enrollments were down for a lot of institutions. I know that there was some hesitancy for folks to come to the United States because of the somewhat hostile climate toward immigrants. And then there was actually some federal policies that were making it a little more challenging for some students to be able to be here from outside the country. In all honesty, I feel like some of that is still going to have to play out over the next couple of years, and we're going to have to see where things land. You know, I think that sometimes decisions get made and there's an immediate sort of backlash to that decision, but you don't really see what the impact is for another 2, 3, 4 years. And I think it'll be a little bit longer before we see the true impact. But I think it definitely has the approaches, not only with the pandemic, but then also the political approaches in the United States. I think it's definitely impacted. And I know that international enrollments have been down overall.
Then another topic you mentioned is the recognition of prior learning and credits. And at the very same time, you were talking about the market orientation, which I think all know if we look to the US and the understanding of higher education per se. But what's about the protection of the degree? So maybe could you elaborate a bit more on this particular perspective on the protection or the degrees in the US context?
Yeah, I think that's where, and I keep saying the word balance, I think that's where we're going to have to strike some kind of balance. And it goes back to your comment about maintaining a focus on tradition, but then also looking at innovation. And I feel like that's where we're at right now. We're in the space where we're trying to figure that out. Absolutely, we want the value of people's degrees and we want our academic integrity, and all of those things are super important. And I think our challenge is to figure out, how do we take the skills that especially an adult learner comes to us with, their skills and their knowledge, how do we translate that into something that's meaningful and effective from the academic perspective, but also helps us to maintain our integrity. There are a lot of things happening with faculty evaluations. I mentioned the portfolios earlier, where people can get credit for their portfolio. Typically at most institutions, those would be evaluated by a faculty member who has expertise in that field, so that you're still looking and assessing the student's skills and knowledge, but maybe just through a different format than a traditional classroom testing project kind of scenario. So I think, to me, these are exciting things because you can create change, right? We don't have to cling to what we've been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years. We can look at new ways of doing things to help people, but also a way, hopefully, that we maintain our integrity in our institutions as well. And I think there's solutions there if we're willing to be creative and try some things and make some things work.
Thank you. I just ask this question because in Austria we have a very controversial discussion on that. One is the flexibility and the student or learner perspective on one hand side, and then on the other hand side, protecting our own degrees. So how, the extent of recognition of prior learning in our programs in order to, kind of ensure the quality. This is maybe one of the official wordings, but on the other hand side, also to keep our students' numbers in those programs. But I think maybe this is just, I have another set of questions, but Pascal, maybe this is a right time just to get also, or give the floor also to other colleagues to come forward and raise issues and discuss questions.
Thanks a lot, Attila. I think you are right. It's a good time to open the floor. I can see we don't have that many questions in the chat, so maybe I would suggest for people to raise their electronic hand, and then they can ask their question directly. by unmuting their microphone. Maybe while people are thinking about their questions, I'd like to come back on one point in Attila's presentation. When we were looking at the desirability of the various scenario, we can see that the market-driven education is not very popular within academic institutions. I would be interested to have Attila's and maybe also Trisha's coming from the US reaction to this. Are we scared? How big is the threat for universities?
Maybe two immediate reactions. One is protection of the freedom, so to say, as we know, the academic freedom. So if we would driven too much or given by the market forces, then we would give up somehow this freedom. And related to this, the danger of market failure. So most probably this would lead to a decrease in certain sectors and an increase in others. And I think this is something I also try to point it out regarding the advantages and disadvantages of the markets, and maybe also certain fields, academic fields, which might take a profit or even a disadvantage because they are not not needed from the business perspective, for example. So I think this is one, and the second is complexity. I think that the market-driven approach would lead to an increased complexity, and this is what many higher education leaders, rectors, presidents across Europe, throughout the movement of new public management and the increased autonomy of higher education institutions, most probably would respond saying that the complexity is increasing, and within the given resources and frameworks, we are not able to deal with this complexity, and therefore we would need to reduce the markets approach a bit, at least.
Thanks, Attila. Trisha from the US, do you see things differently over there?
Yeah, so let me just first say that this is the world according to Trish, and I do not represent all of US higher education, right? So I'm going to give you my opinion, but that doesn't mean that everyone in the US and probably a lot of people in the US would disagree with me. I think the collaboration between the market and higher ed is an amazing opportunity. I think if we can work together, we can create things that have more meaning to our students. Now, again, with the importance of maintaining the integrity and us setting the academic standards, because we are the experts in that in higher education. But I think there's ways that can do that. And we've done a lot of that in my institution. We're doing a lot of partners, and I work in healthcare, and I'm specifically partnering with some healthcare institutions where we create the academic content, and then they do the hands-on skills training. And it's a very collaborative approach, and they're getting what they need. The students are getting what they need. The institution is getting what we need because we're getting enrollments and we have students and we're helping train them to go on and live meaningful lives. And then we're also, because we have those scaffolded programs, those students who come through the program that their employer puts them in have opportunities to move up into higher level programs if they want to. So I think market forces and working with employers can be fabulous opportunities. And that doesn't mean that employers have 100% control over what's going on, but it means there's input and collaboration so that we can all find common areas for things and create a win-win-win situations for the students, for the academic institutions, and for the employers, and ultimately then for the economy and the market.
Thanks a lot for this answer. I can see in the chat that Balázs from University of Pécs, who is also the president of UCAN, by the way, would like to make a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for both presenters to bring up so interesting focuses on universal lifelong learning. Just one comment to this market-driven type of education. I think there are several questions, and my just short comment to Attila. I think we also need to put things into consideration regarding interdisciplinary aspects. For example, what role for the state? What is higher education in the context of welfare and services in association with quality and access? So this is something like providing several questions for ethical concerns. Likewise, the twofold aspect of what kind of education and for who, with what access. And there is a danger today. If you have a good look on the latest education and training monitor of the European Commission, is that for the member states, early school leave is rising in a number of countries, opposite to participation in adult education. So the scissor in this regard is opening up. So there's quite a number of concerns. This is what I wanted to make as a comment. And I think still what you have raised, Attila, regarding scenarios, I think there are several opportunities with all in these things that higher education institutions might make use of. Still, I think we need to learn from good cases where there are good lessons from not only through Europe, but also from different continents. Again, thank you very much for the presentations.
Pascal, may I just quickly respond to Balázs? Thank you very much, Balázs. Maybe two quick answers or directions. One is, we always refer in this regard to the social contract between society and universities. But the question is, what is inside? And we always say this social contract needs to be revised and needs to be developed further. When we look beyond the contract, we come easily up with the three missions, right? Teaching, learning, and research. And then the third mission, which is now a kind of a buzzword to leave the ivory tower. And I would continue education, transfer, knowledge transfer, and the community or social engagement of universities in this particular mission on the third mission or services. But I think the constantly revision of the social contract is needed. And maybe this is the reason, and this is my second point, why the European Commission is going to establish a new working group on the quality investment in education and training. I don't know why. Okay, just a second. I will share you in a second the link to this. So Commissioner Gabriel is going to introduce this new working group next week. And maybe this working group should come up with some answers to your points and to your questions in the near future, at least in the context of the European higher education.
Thank you very much, Attila. Are there any question? If you want, we have a few more minutes. Good opportunity to ask questions. So you can just raise your electronic hand. While you think about it, Tricia, you mentioned that one of the results of the situation we live in is a rise in social inequalities, and that they are more apparent. So I would be interested to know, what do you think can be done to improve the situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, another politically loaded question, at least here in the United States. But I think it was really clear when the pandemic hit last year, where there was less access to internet, and where people did not even have devices to connect to internet. And so I know some of one of the large school systems I live in Des Moines, Iowa, and they had many students who didn't even have devices to be able to access the internet and didn't have internet connections. And the Des Moines Public Schools spent a lot of time and money just providing devices for students so those students could have access. Those are the kinds of things that I think we're going to have to really think about as a society, that digitalization is amazing and it provides incredible access to opportunities that you might not have if you had to do a face-to-face learning experience. But if you don't have access to the technology, then the opportunities aren't there. So being intentional, both within our government structures and within our public structures, in figuring out how to get that access to folks and how to equalize that. They call it, the research articles here in the US call it the digital divide, how to bridge the digital divide, doing everything we can at all institutional levels to make that easier for folks, so that they can get access to the resources that can be provided, I think is going to be really important. And unfortunately, takes money, right? Everything comes back to the dollars. And that's where, again, I think collaboration with market forces, if you can get larger organizations that have technology to be able to provide some opportunities for people and to support those efforts, I think that's where a lot of that collaboration can be pretty effective.
Thank you. Attila, would you like to comment on the situation in Europe with regard to social inequalities?
Well, I think that's Trish mentioned the key elements. I think this is not only the context of the US society, it's also regards the European societies as well. If I may kind of narrow down a bit your question to academia, and if I look at the recent research and results, we see that the pandemic, for example, in terms of inequality within academia, led to a number of developments which I think are alarming. Just to give you an example, the submission of research articles and research proposals during the pandemic has dramatically changed towards the submission of men's but not female submission. So it looks like that there is a negative effect on female researchers, and the causalities are here because of the family responsibilities, childcare, and so on. But we see within a couple of months or a year time, inequalities can appear very quickly. So it's not only the digitalization as a dimension, but there are many other dimensions like the pandemic, which leads to these divides. And I think they need a very close monitoring. I think this is the responsibility to governments, but also higher education research, obviously. And then we need to find proper solutions here. And I remember for example, just going back to what Trish said, that, for example, for US university, it was very critical that students would stay, but not go back home, just because they would return to their environment and families, and this might lead to an effect also on the learning processes and achievements because of access to the internet, for example, or other duties within the families. And if I look to different regions like Asia or Africa, this is even more dramatic. So I think these are effects which you can't really plan, but you need to react. And I think this is something that definitely we need to follow. And most probably in all three scenarios, you would see a certain effects of divide: a digital divide, a societal divide, a divide in income, and so on and so on. And I think this is maybe our European tradition, while we trust in our governments and the policymakers that they come up with maybe mega policies or solutions that we are able to cope with those developments as well.
Thank you very much, Attila. There have been interesting exchanges in the chat, so maybe you've seen them. I can see that Trish has been very active in giving precise and quick answers to the participants. So probably you've seen it all. We are getting towards the end of this event. I think it is time for me to thank very much Attila and Trish. It was great. I loved it, and this I think there is so much value in this exchange between the two continents. It was fantastic. Thank you so much to the two speakers. I would also like to thank all the participants who joined today, and the UCAN Secretariat, which made it all possible. Just to remind you, the seminar was brought to you by UCAN, the European University Continuing Education Network, AAAACE, the American Association for Adult and Continuing Education, and UPCEA, the University Professional and Continuing Education Association. Thank you so much, and we'll meet again. I hope we'll have soon an opportunity also to meet face to face, and that we'll meet soon. I don't know if the UCAN Secretariat has any announcement to make, or if we leave it here. I think this is the end. Thank you so much, everybody. Hope to see you soon.